And you're back with the Monocle Daily live from Studio One. This is Emma Nelson and Andrew Muller. Now, while the nations of the West have dithered about whether or not to intervene in Syria, many of their citizens have acted on their own initiative and unfortunately teamed up with the people their governments would have been unlikely to help. France, now seeking to discourage any more would-be jihadis from departing their shores, is about to propose stiff new legislation aimed at stopping them.
The new laws, if passed, will enable France to rescind the passports of people deemed a threat by French spooks and to force internet providers to block websites promoting terrorism, whatever that means. These developments occur against the background of reports suggesting that French authorities foiled a plot to target the Louvre and the Eiffel Tower. Well, joining us now in the studio is Marie Bilonna, who's the chief editor of French Radio London and UK correspondent for French media. And on the line we have the Franco-Algerian journalist and regular Monocle contributor Nabila Ramdani. Marie, I'll start with you first. As far as we can tell, this plot to blow up or attack the Louvre and the Eiffel Tower, how serious does that sound?
Well, that sound not that serious because basically they knew about it for 1 year before disclosing it. So it was a lone wolf, as they say, who had contact with the right people, but in the end he was alone. He never been trained because he was waiting to go to Algeria to be trained before he got caught. So basically there was a long way to go before he could basically do anything. So it might have been serious, but they stopped it way before he became serious. So it could have been, but it's not. And I think they're really basically blowing the story today because of this new law they are trying to put forward.
It does seem like a rather delicious coincidence, doesn't it? I mean, just looking at the way that France and its terrorism, France handles its terrorism. When I think of France, you think of a country which deals with an awful lot of integration from Arabic countries, which often has to deal with, as you say, lone wolves, individual attacks. But the last large attack ever to have succeeded on French soil was 1995, the metro bombings. It's one of those countries that seems to have on the surface what looks like a terribly big problem, but in actual fact seems to manage it. Why this need for new laws?
Well, there was Mohamed Merah a few months ago he was a lone wolf and he managed to kill a few militaries. So there was that, and the guy who killed the people in Brussels in front of the Jewish Museum, he was French. So in the end, nothing big happened in France because I guess we are quite well organized. But there are a lot of people who are being ridiculized, and even if they don't do anything in France, they do go abroad. There are something like 800 people who are there or who've been there who want to go there. So even if nothing happens, that's let's face it, that's great that nothing happened in France. But there's a lot of people in France who would like that something basically happen, and that's what they want to try and stop.
Nabila Ramdani, I'll bring you in at this point. This law, which would enable France to rescind the passports of suspected jihadis, is it actually going to make any difference on the grounds that you don't need a passport to leave France to anywhere else in Europe thanks to the Schengen Agreement? French citizens don't need passports to enter Turkey, and of course it's Turkey's border with Syria, which nobody bothers to patrol, which is the way in and out of that battleground.
Well, actually, your guest in the studios has quite well highlighted, not only the PR aspect in the announcement of this proposed law. The government here is using the usual tactic of leaking terrorist threats to society, and this is how governments gather public support to introduce that type of legislations. But she also pointed out to the limitations of this law. Indeed, this proposed legislation is aimed at doing its best domestically, but we are dealing with a global society, and as it proved time and time again, French terrorists operate all over the world and not just in France. And in fact, they spend a lot of time abroad training and buying weapons, for example, and only pay fleeting visits to France. Why? Precisely because the legislation in place is already very strong at stopping them. Meanwhile, it's always innocent people who are the real victims of this proposed legislation because they are made to feel like terrorists constantly, and it has to be said, especially young Muslim men.
Staying with you, Nabila, in terms of where France stands with its terror laws, you say it's very strict. It is strict. But if you look at somewhere like the United Kingdom, comparable laws like this already exist in terms of if you are seen to be, if they think you're going to be a threat, or they consider you to have been abroad to train for terrorist purposes, you can be arrested at the border and you can be put on trial for it. I mean, is this actually a case of France playing catch up a little?
Well, I think in principle, any measure aimed at protecting people from terrorist attack is clearly to be welcome. That is the number one duty of any state, of any government. It is to protect its citizens and indeed to protect society at large. But this new legislation is built as an anti-terrorism law, and that is the term that is being bandied around in the French media. And clearly for the government, this priority seems to transcend everything else, including civil liberties. But anti-terrorism legislation is often used to suppress human rights and indeed to stigmatize. And in this case, terrorism is firmly associated in France with the Muslim minority of some 6 million people living on French territory. And every effort is made by politicians across the political spectrum to point to an apparent enemy within who will stop at nothing to cause death and indeed destruction. But the great problem with legislation like this is that there is never any sensible proportion. And it's like saying that you're going to bring in special powers to arrest anybody who might look like a burglar so as to cope with a domestic crime wave. There would be an absolute outcry if special powers were brought in to deprive anybody who looks like a criminal of the most basic rights. And legislation of this kind has been brought in before, and it shows that in fact it is used to bring in something completely different. It looks as though it is there to single out any potential terrorist, but in reality, if you're dark-skinned, if you wear Muslim clothes or a beard, you can be stopped, searched and prevented from flying because you would be deemed to look like a terrorist. That is often what happens.
Marie, back here in the studio, how seriously do these things, or does this potential threat get taken, do you think, by the French public?
Well, I have been in French for a long time, so I wouldn't be able to say exactly. But I do think I do think they take it quite seriously. As we said before, there was something that happened in the underground in 1995, and that was quite of a shock in France. So they don't want that to happen again. When it's with airports and all that, there's never been anything major that happened in French airports. So I don't know how seriously they do take the threat, but. I do think that French people, being what they are perhaps more focusing, at least today, about basically the civil liberty issue around those laws, this new law that's going to basically be put forward in Parliament. That's perhaps the threats it really try to combat. I think the civil liberty issue is uppermost in the mind of French people today. We'll see a bit later, but today they don't think about the threat, they think about the civil liberty, I think.
Marie Billon, Chief Editor of French Radio London and UK correspondent for French media, and on the line, the Franco-Algerian journalist and regular Monocle contributor Nabila Ramdani. Thank you to you both.